Hi, and welcome to another broadcast from the Pirate Party here in Massachusetts. My name is Joseph. I'm the quartermaster for the Pirate Party. With me tonight, I have Desmond, and tonight we are here to talk about sex worker rights. Say hi, Desmond.
Hi, Joe, and hi to everyone out there.
So, really, we want to really dive right into this. This has become a new hot topic for us to really focus on. Desmond, in a brief summary, could you tell us a little bit about what sex worker rights is all about?
Well, sex worker rights are basically extending the labor and human rights that everyone else enjoys to those who are engaged in the commercial sex industry. That can be prostitution, which is also known as full service sex work, but also those engaged in exotic dancing, cam work, and so forth. Which, while even though those are legal, still face certain regulations and stigma that deprive them of the rights that the rest of us normally enjoy. And what sex workers have called for is what they call decriminalization, which is to remove it from criminal law and from excessive regulation and really put the focus of control on those who are doing the work rather than to the police or to puritanical bodies taking over certain agencies and regulating to an excessive degree.
Now, I see you really went right into the matter where you're talking about decriminalization versus other forms. Um, and so, like the Swedish model and stuff like that. Could you tell
Right.
me a little bit about what the difference is between the Swedish model versus a decriminalized model?
Sure. The Swedish model or Nordic model, as it's called, also it's called the end demand model, basically says that there that a government is not going to have a law or prosecute people for selling sex, but they will prosecute people for buying sex, which is a little bit like, imagine you go into a grocery store and you buy a chocolate bar, but because there are concerns about trafficking in the cocoa production, and because you bought it, you can get arrested, but the store you bought it from can't be prosecuted. What many people who advocate the Swedish model don't point out is that there are other laws that criminalize many aspects of commercial sex, such as if two or more people are working in the same location, they can be prosecuted for brothel keeping. If anyone receives income from a sex worker for doing something like driving them to a location, managing their website, screening their calls, because they're, quote, living off the avails of prostitution, they can be convicted for pimping, even if though they're the employee of the sex worker. So really, it's often called asymmetrical criminalization, and it still puts a heavy burden on sex workers. It doesn't give them the freedom to actually control their work or control their lives and make sure that they can do things safely.
And so, the whole point of this, at least as far as I can understand it, is that when you put it into a criminalized state, you're really just creating a very unsafe environment. Whereas if somebody were to harm or
Mhm.
cause the sex worker harm or cause the a bad situation, there's no recourse for them to go.
Exactly right, Joe. They don't have recourse. In fact, there was a recent case where a sex worker went to police in Tennessee, reported that she had been raped. They arrested her. That's the kind of situation that sex workers face all the time. Even if they're going to prosecute, they then focus efforts. And also in countries like Sweden or Norway that have adopted this focus on the client, they will in fact put pressure on sex workers, on their landlords, on their acquaintances, because they claim that their goal is to abolish prostitution, or as they like to call it, commercial sex exploitation, without regard to whether they went into it by consent, whether it was because economic circumstances give them few options. There's no focus on that. There's only a focus on, we want to get rid of it, so we're going to pressure the landlord to evict the sex worker. And that's the problem with the criminalized systems, whether it's the Swedish model or the full criminalization model we have in the States, versus decriminalization in New Zealand and New South Wales, which has successfully been shown by studies to improve their overall health and safety and to really give them recourse in the legal system, both in civil law and criminal law, to protect themselves.
Okay, so the argument I often hear with this whole industry and the whole legal thing is when you criminalize the sex work, you're actually trying to fight the trafficking. And from what I understand, trafficking is something completely different versus the sex work itself. Can you help me pinpoint some of these differences and how they're really just two separate issues?
Absolutely. With trafficking, whether you're dealing with sex trafficking in particular or labor trafficking generally, and in my view, since sex work is work, sex trafficking is a form of labor trafficking. It is recruiting someone by force, fraud, or deceit and giving them little or no benefit at all, so that someone who's being trafficked for their labor, whatever that labor may be, they're not really earning a wage, or they're not able to earn a living wage, and they're drawn into it by deception or by outright force. They're not really consenting, versus people who enter sex work consensually, whether it's because, as I said, their economic circumstances are such that this is the best option they have, or those who enter into it fully willingly. They actually have given it a lot of thought. But whatever reason they're in, if they're not being coerced and they are able to make a living, then they should have the same labor rights as others. We do not try to shut down the cocoa production industry because of the child labor and trafficked labor that goes on in it. Instead, we try to pressure individual producers to change how they do business. We try to pressure governments to crack down on them. We encourage reverse boycotts where people like myself will go up buy fair trade chocolate. So, there's a lot of labor trafficking that goes on in domestic work, in agriculture, in the fashion and clothing industry. We don't try to close those industries down. We try to make sure that every worker has the rights, and we try to take those parts of the industries where people are being trafficked in that labor and try to help those laborers to find work where there is a choice and they are getting compensated, they are getting protected in terms of health and safety regulations. And that is what sex workers want, and that is what they deserve.
Okay. And again, going into the real distinctions, I kind of like how you really went in there where trafficking for sex work is more like labor work. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that for me?
Well, if somebody, for example, decides to go into escorting, and whether they're an independent escort who then finds somebody to design a website for them and to screen their calls, that would be much the same as someone who decided, well, I'm going to go into the catering business, I'm going to start my own catering business. They're doing that freely. They're getting the compensation for it. Whereas if you have somebody who decides they're going to go into catering, but they're going to deceive people into doing the work for them and they're not going to pay them, then that person is trafficking other people's labor. That's the stereotype that we see talking about sex work, is saying that there's somebody out there who's coercing and deceiving people into engaging in sex for money and then keeping the money for themselves. Well, that's actually a lot more rare than people believe it is. And many times it's not because of huge international gangs. It's many times a family member who's coercing a young person into doing this, or an intimate partner violence situation where the abuser is coercing their abused partner into doing it. It's not, the grand conspiracies that many people will have. But the difference is that we already have laws against involuntary servitude. We already have laws and policy against labor trafficking. The problem is that those who want to really abolish sex work, whatever the human cost as a result, deliberately engage in deception themselves by trying to conflate sex work that people go into on their own with sex trafficking, with people being coerced and deprived of their rights and of the income for their work.
Okay. And so coming up, we are doing an event coming up on December 16th for a vigil. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. This vigil is being held in conjunction with the International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers. And we are holding it Sunday, December 16th, 7 p.m. in front of Boston Police Headquarters, 1 Schroeder Plaza in Roxbury. And the reason that we picked the police headquarters is because whenever sex work is criminalized, the bulk of abuses that go on come from law enforcement. Now, I know that Commissioner Gross and Attorney General Maura Healey are going to say, oh, not our cops. Well, I'm sorry, we're talking about a systemic problem. And to have this vigil in front of the top symbol in the city of law enforcement, I think sends a clear message that we don't want this to happen, whether it's in Boston or the Berkshires or any place else. We would rather that sex workers have the rights that they deserve, and that we would want to see decriminalization happen in Massachusetts and elsewhere. And even before that, we could even talk about a moratorium on arrests altogether, that we act as though sex work is decriminalized, that we work with sex workers, with their peer-led organizations to meet their needs in some way and to assure greater safety, instead of just paternalistically presuming that if we arrest all the clients and we arrest all the pimps, the problem will go away. Sex work is not going away, and making things more dangerous by arresting clients and third-party associates of sex workers is not the answer. It has never been proven to work. Decriminalization has worked in New Zealand and New South Wales, and a de facto approach has worked in cities in British Columbia. We need to take that approach here in Boston and across the Commonwealth.
Okay, and I appreciate that. And really, we're not the first ones to really bring this up as a major issue. There's already been a TED Talk and then another talk by some people on the subject. Yeah, I believe you're familiar with them, correct?
There's a whole list of, Joe, there's a whole list of growing list of vanization from a public health perspective, from a human rights perspective, from a women's rights perspective. Amnesty International famously went to support decriminalization. Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, the American Jewish Service Committee has supported it. Across the spectrum, from libertarians to socialists, there are political and public health and other groups that have been supporting decriminalization. And the bottom line is because this has been shown to work in New Zealand, New South Wales. This is what sex workers themselves want. This is the gateway by which they can achieve the solutions for greater safety, greater respect, greater dignity. And that's why the Pirate Party has taken that on, and why we're having this vigil and hope to have other events as well.
Yes, and we do. And we do as well. And hopefully, again, we're going to be doing this in December. Look for our Facebook post on it, and hopefully we can have you come down here and really see us in person and learn more about us. Thank you so much for letting me have you on the show tonight, and I really appreciate everything you're doing for us, Desmond.
My pleasure, Jim. Talk to you soon.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.